This is Joshua Swamidas, and I'm here with John Lennox. John Lennox is a mathematician from Oxford. I think that's right? And a mathematician at Oxford.
Yeah, I'm a professor emeritus at Oxford, yes.
Who has been in the public square talking about big questions about religion and faith and engaging with atheists for decades now. He just had a movie come out really exploring and explaining kind of his public life over the last several decades, called Against the Tide. And it's really with that in mind that we invited him to give a talk to talk to us here at Peaceful Science to hear more about what his path in a secular world engaging with atheists has been like, and whether or not there's potentially better ways for us to engage with one another. So, John, thanks a lot for coming here, and I'd love for you to just introduce yourself a little bit more and tell people a little bit more, especially for those who maybe are a little bit less familiar with your work, who you are and what you've done.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I like the title of your show, Peaceful Science. So we're not going to talk about automatic artificial intelligent war machines today. But I have been at Oxford for the past 20 odd years, and I come from Northern Ireland, which is relevant to my story, very relevant to it, because in my teenage years, Northern Ireland was a hotbed of religious factions and indeed a lot of violence, from which my own family suffered. My father's business was bombed on several occasions. And my parents left a deep impression on me, and that will explain a great deal where I'm coming from. Firstly, they were Christian, but in a very sectarian context, they were not sectarian, in that my father had a store, employed, I suppose, 30 to 40 people, and he deliberately employed people from both sides of the religious divide.
So to give some context, you're talking about the religious divide of Protestant Catholic?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
So in Northern Ireland, I remember growing up that there was still terrorist acts and things like that, and that Protestant Catholic divide was a very big social divide. It might have been nearly as bad as Republicans and Democrats today. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I am not here to comment on the American political system, but the point is, yes, there was a lot of tension, and it was superficially between a religious thing, but actually it was cultural, it was sociological, but we needn't go into that because it had the name of being violence from within Christendom, so to speak.
And the key thing is that your father was modeling something about kind of being above that somehow, right?
Yes, I asked my father, why do you employ people from both sides? He said, look, my fundamental belief is the biblical one, that all human beings, whatever they believe, are made in the image of God and therefore worthy of respect, and I'm going to treat them like that. Now, that left a very deep impression on me because he took the risk and it cost him. My brother was nearly killed by a bomb and so on. The second thing my parents did was that although they were very convinced Christians, they gave me space to think. They didn't force their beliefs down my throat. On the contrary, they not only opened my eyes to the riches of the Bible factually and informationally, they encouraged me to read other worldviews. And I grew up in a home as a teenager with a view of Christianity that was very open-minded and was mind-expansive rather than narrow and prejudiced and bigoted. And being encouraged to read all kinds of stuff, including, by the way, the Communist Manifesto, was a very good start for going up to Cambridge in 1962. So I was always interested in the big picture. I developed an early interest in languages, and then that moved on to physics and electrical engineering, but my headmaster told me one day that I might get into Cambridge if I concentrated on mathematics. So that's why I went for mathematics. But where does mathematics fit into science? Where does science fit into our ways of understanding reality? Those were questions that I was fascinated by from the age of 12 or 13 onwards. So that when I got to Cambridge, I took an additional course in philosophy of science, and I've been interested in that ever since. And I suppose that although my professional life has concentrated on pure mathematics, the theory of groups within algebra, I have also at the same time been very involved in thinking of the philosophy of science and looking at that wonderful area, which is the intersection of philosophy, science, and theology. And because, of course, I came to Cambridge as a Christian, I felt, and I should say that I believed that it was true, not simply it was a comfortable religion. And so I got involved right from the very word go in discussions as to the truth of Christianity, because of course everybody I met tended to say to me, well, of course you believe in God, you're Irish, all you Irish believe in God, you fight about it. So I had something to overcome. And when I was challenged with that in Cambridge in those early days, I decided that since I now had a unique opportunity at one of the best universities in the world to get to know people who did not share my worldview, that's what I was going to do. And I've done it all my life. So that's a potted background, Joshua.
That's really great. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how it is and when and why you started publicly debating some atheists?
Oh, that was a much more recent development. The point is, I was very open with my student contemporaries.
Okay, yeah.
And I spent a lot of time playing Socrates because I really am interested in what makes people think.
And so you mean like asking questions to understand where people are and help people think better, or?
Well, possibly, but to help me think better.
I see.
In other words, I went out of my way, and I still do, to get to know people and find out why they believe what they believe. So I was fascinated always with the diametrical opposite of my Christian belief system, and that is atheism. Of course, I was interested in the shades in between, and I came across C.S. Lewis long before I went to university, and he helped me enormously intellectually because I have no idea what it's like to be an atheist as an adult or even as a child. And I needed guidance, and I got it from Lewis, who became a Christian in his mid-30s. And not only that, Lewis was a tremendous guide. He wasn't a scientist, but he understood the philosophy of science, and he understood ancient literature. Now, I had the good fortune when I was about 14 to be introduced to a person who became a close friend and with whom I worked. He died last year at the age of 94. And he was a classicist, an expert on Latin and Greek. And he introduced me to the ancient world. And therefore, I regard literature and ancient philosophy essentially as just as important when it comes to understanding life as the sciences. And I've been enormously fortunate in having a person like that to guide me and to discuss with. Debating atheists came late on. My first major debate was, when was it? 1997 with Richard Dawkins in Birmingham, Alabama. I'd never done anything like it before. I'd had a lot of minor discussions with people, and I'd given many lectures in many universities around the place. But this was something I was invited to do. I didn't suggest it. But that started, of course, that it immediately put me, I didn't realize at the time, but it put me on a world stage and gave me enormous opportunities to discuss and debate with the leading atheists in the world. But it was a natural outcome of being interested, as you are, obviously, in doing this broadcast, in the public space. And in my country, a lot of time is given in the public space to naturalism. And so much so that it's regarded really as the default worldview. And I think it is a worldview, but it's not a default worldview. And therefore, people like myself need to get into the public space to give people an alternative view to think about and then make up their own mind. I'm a great believer in people making up their own mind.
So we were talking about this earlier in the sense that you really wanted to clarify that you're not an apologist. So can you explain what you mean by apologist, why you're not it, and what you would describe yourself as?
I need to explain that. It's not that I'm not an apologist.
Okay, go ahead and explain it, yeah.
Yes. The word apologist or apologetics comes from a Greek word apologia. And the unfortunate thing is it's been taken straight into English. It hasn't been translated, which is very foolish, really, because it gives the impression that you're apologizing for something, which is nonsense. And the word has a simple meaning. It means defense.
Is defense kind of a problem too? I mean, there's another meaning for apologia, which is just an explanation.
Well, exactly, but it is an apologia. It's the logic going away from. So in that sense, it is a defense. I'm happy with an explanation as a defense. That's okay.
Well, I think it's important because I would say that I'm not an apologist either, for a lot of reasons that are probably similar to yours. But one is, I think the fixation on translating it as defense really does disservice to it. Kind of seems to convey this idea that our faith needs it, or that Jesus needs a defense, or that he doesn't need a defense. He needs an explanation. He asked for.
Yeah, but you need to let me finish what I mean by defense.
Sure.
Because when we see that word used in the book of Acts by Paul, the apostle, what he understands under apologia is, first of all, explaining what happened to him on the Damascus Road, his experience of God. He explains that. And then you cannot open your mouth, at least I've found this, in a multicultural, pluralistic society and try to explain the Christian faith without finding that people have major questions. And apologia, properly understood, is answering people's questions and explaining the difficulties as you understand them and explaining what you believe. So however you put it, I'm in the business that you're in, and that's explaining to people who have big questions. So if you stand back from that, of course, you're defending what you believe and what you do, but that's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. Now, I mean, with this too, I really noticed that you're engaging with atheists. You mentioned atheism a lot, and I have a lot of friends that are atheists. There's a lot of atheists in science, right? And
I know, so have I.
And there's some questions that I might be pulling from the chat too regarding this, but Christians don't do a very good job with atheists in general. Sometimes they're kind of really vilified and made the enemy. And you're talking about respecting them. How do you respect them? How could we do a better job in a way that even if we disagree with them on things that are very important to us, we can still find common ground, common humanity, and really treat them well, and not just an apologetics project in the negative sense?
Well, let's first, you said Christians don't do a good job. I think that's a wild generalization.
Oh, of course.
Some Christians don't do a good job. And I think the respect thing that I told you about my parents is absolutely crucial. And for that reason, I want to befriend these people. And I seriously mean that. I mean, I've done this in public. I want to be friendly and get involved in discussing ideas and not using ad hominem arguments. Now, of course, there are some militant atheists, but there are not very many of those. Most of my atheist friends are very nice people indeed. I respect them and they respect me. And we don't have any difficulty in discussing. And I suspect that the answer to your question is that we need to learn, some Christians need to learn not to treat those who disagree with them simply as targets.
Yeah, I think that that's so critical right now. I mean, especially when things are so divided.
Yes, that's right.
And now let's take it to the hard place, though. Most atheists are really friendly, right? But then there's some atheists that really are, as you called it, militant, or legitimately anti-religious. How do we treat them as our neighbor too, or are they not our neighbor?
I think they're our neighbor, but it's keeping the militancy on the other side. The worst thing we can do is to get angry. I think once a person gets angry, they've lost the plot.
So you're saying they might come, I mean, some atheists, to be clear, not all atheists are militant atheists. And I think
Absolutely not.
But if they do come in that militant sort of way, we shouldn't respond in a militant way. We should
Absolutely not. No, there's no need to. And the interesting thing is there are two kinds of militant atheists. There are those that are genuinely, intrinsically militant. And there are those that put on a show in public. And when you've finished, you could go and have a drink and a chat with them without any difficulty. And Christopher Hitchens was like that, the late Christopher Hitchens. Yeah. If you watch his public engagement with me, he just tried to rip me to shreds. But afterwards, we go out and talk. And he and I got on very well together. So the public thing, you can easily be misled by it. Now, one thing that has been very noticeable in my experience is that most of my atheist people I know do not want confrontational debates anymore.
Yeah, it's true.
What they want is a good, moderated discussion. And I've had several write to me after and said, thank you very much for not demanding a debate. That was a great discussion. And I think
like Veritas forums. You've done stuff with Veritas forums too. I've done a few of them too. They're really good at setting up.
I think I did hold the record for the maximum number of
how many
Veritas forums. I've done very many of them, and that's right. Some of them have really illustrated that principle very well, and I think they represent a very important kind of forum. People are interested in ideas, and if they realize that I respect the person with whom I'm discussing, and also I believe that the audience is capable of evaluating arguments and making up their own minds, I think that impression, which I really believe in, is very important to convey.
It's interesting too, as I talk to people nowadays, I'm in a different generation. I'm just, I just turned 42, so I'm a little younger.
I'm 77.
And so, and honestly, I mean, I grew up knowing about you and reading some of your books, and so it is a real privilege and a pleasure to even be able to talk to you like now. I mean, it's kind of exciting. But I think one thing that may be different between where things are now versus where they were like in the 90s, I'm kind of curious. Is I think the question, and it's a different context too. You're in England, so I don't know. It seemed like when I was younger, the question often was, is Christianity true? Or is religion true? But I think now the question seems to be actually quite different. Not that people don't care about, is it true? But the much more dominant question is it good? And so it's not about if God exists, but if God is good. And not just if religion has foundation, but if religion is good. Have you seen that shift too? Or how would you answer that question?
Well, my reaction to that is an eagle needs two wings to fly. And those two questions, the goodness of God has been a question as far back as history and literature go.
Yeah.
And it's just that in the contemporary world, what I have noticed is that there's probably a good deal more relativism than there was for a while, although that's very ancient as well. And I find people interested in the truth question, often they're scientists, but the people from the humanities are very interested in goodness and morality and that kind of thing. And I have noticed a shift in the sense that I wrote a book some time ago called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Which, by the way, I have massively amplified and revised, and it will reappear under a new name because it's completely different next summer. It's called Cosmic Chemistry, Do Science and God Mix? But after writing that book, I realized that there was an increasing moral attack on Christianity. Now, Dawkins went in that area, but Hitchens even more. So I wrote another book which concentrated much more on that. It's called Gunning for God, Why the New Atheists Are Missing the Target. And there I tried
I think you're right. The New Atheists, actually, their argument fundamentally wasn't an epistemological challenge. It really was a moral challenge. They were saying...
Well, in that epoch, very much so.
Yeah. That's interesting. So God's Undertaker, I don't know if you remember, but we had some email exchanges about that.
Yes, I do.
I probably annoyed you a little bit with that.
I don't recall being annoyed. It takes an awful lot to annoy me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually kind of curious how this evolved, and I don't want to be on the spot. I just found out, I mean, you just brought it up, but I agree with a lot of the things that you said and the way you've gone. One of the places where I disagreed was, like, for example, some of the information arguments about DNA that you made. Is that still going to be in the book, or have you modified it or adjusted
that? You'll have to discuss this with me when this book comes out.
Okay.
Because it is very different in its scope in dealing with arguments from information. Yes.
Okay. Well, maybe you can send me a preprint of it and we can talk about it. But that's a minor point. I mean, I think that there's going to be those sorts of disagreements that come up at time amongst Christian scholars.
Well, of course there are,
and that's not a bad thing.
World, and there are many different minds. That's what makes life interesting.
You've been in the public square for a very long time. This is a hard question, but I think it's an important one. Is there any, especially I think when it comes to if it can be answered in certain ways, which maybe you can't honestly answer in a way that would do so, but if we could be honest about these things, and they really are there, sometimes it can really build trust too. When you think about like the public arguments you've made, is there any that you think, I kind of overstated the case, that wasn't really as strong as I thought, and maybe I wouldn't really make that argument anymore? Have you changed your mind on anything, is another way to put it?
Well, I hope that my mind has developed over the years. And one thing I discover is that hindsight is 20/20 vision.
Yeah.
And if you take these things seriously, every occasion you look back and think, I didn't put that well, or I missed that point. And one notable occasion was the debate with Richard Dawkins in Oxford in the Natural History Museum. When I walked into the museum, I suddenly remembered that this museum had been dedicated to the glory of God. And I tried to find evidence of it in the 5 minutes before the debate, and I went to the staff and they'd never heard of it. And in the debate, I tentatively, Richard worked there at one stage, you see, he had an office in the very building. And I said, but isn't it true that this building was dedicated to the glory of God? Oh, absolutely not, he said, but he was entirely wrong. Immediately afterwards, I discovered that the irony was that the building had been built with money, profits from the sale of Bibles for the Oxford University Press. And Ackland, who had it built, dedicated it to showing people the glory of creation. So there was something where I felt I'd really blown it, and I could have made a much more powerful point. But this is inevitably true. I don't find it difficult to admit that, because I have discovered a long time ago that I am a fallen human who needs salvation like everybody else. So I'm not perfect, and I hope that I can learn from my experiences. And I've learned a vast amount about how to deal with people. But the thing that I would emphasize here, I have never gone into a debate to win. Now, that attitude is hugely different from going in to win. If you go in to try to win, the danger is that you really will blow arguments. You'll cut corners to make emotional points. And you will know all this, of course, because you've been involved in many discussions. My view, and it was taught to me by a brilliant journalist, not a Christian, a brilliant secular journalist who's a household name in this country. He said to me, when you're involved in these debates, make sure that you don't simply react to what the other person is saying, but make sure that through all the noise and all the interchange, you are able to make a clear statement of what it is that represents your position. And I found that such helpful advice, because the danger is, especially if you're not first in the debate, that you start reacting and the people never hear what you think or what you believe. And so they can't make up their mind about it. So I'm not so much there to win every argument. I may lose, but if my attitude stays reasonably okay, and again, I'd emphasize, I'm not perfect. None of us are, but I'm not. If I show real respect for people, over the years, I've discovered that that has counted with the audiences far more, in many cases, than winning arguments.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for me. Like I said, I'm in a different place, but there are some similarities. I'm a computational biologist, not a mathematician, but I think one place where I've noticed some similarities is we're both really spanning a lot of different disciplines in the work that we do. And we're also engaging with non-Christians. And when I think about when I'm at your stage, how I want to look back on things, I don't want to have a bunch of debates where it was like a win or lose. I want to have a lot of connections that I've made with people in conversations, and where I was seeking to understand and be understood, you know?
Exactly. Well, that's right. That's absolutely right.
And one other thing I really like about your work is that you talk about Jesus and the resurrection, which is distinct from, I mean, perhaps this is shocking. I mean, at times it's shocking to me. At other times it's just standard. A lot of Christians in the public square don't talk about that.
So Richard Dawkins has noticed.
Why? First of all, I want to know why it is that you talk about the resurrection of Jesus, the fact that there's evidence that we see that seems to indicate this man rose from the dead. I mean, that's why I follow Jesus. That's how I know God is good, that he exists, and he wants to be known. You talk about that too, really directly. Why do you talk about it? And then secondly, why do you think so many Christians don't? And they focus on other things, like, you know, arguments against evolution or politics, or you can just name it. All these other things end up crowding that out. Why is that?
Well, there are several reasons, I think. I talk about it because I understand it to be the central message of the Christian good news. And looking back historically, it was that message that was first announced in Jerusalem. It was that message that was central to the proclamations of the apostles like Peter and Paul and so on. And it has been the, if I might put it this way, the rediscovery of that message that has caused many reformations and revivals throughout history. And without it, there's no substance in Christianity, because the flip side question is, who is Jesus Christ? And if he rose from the dead and the death barrier has been conquered, that's a vastly important question, particularly in this age of people like Yuval Noah Harari trying to promise through artificial intelligence that folk will be able to live forever by uploading their brains. I've just written a book, as you probably know, called 2084, discussing that. But Christianity has something to say about all these things. Now,
Before you go on to ask more, there's a good question that came up in the chat. So if you could just answer this in a thumbnail, I think it'd be really helpful. How do you get from the text on a page in ancient documents to a man actually raised from the dead? See, it says deus there, but I think it means dead.
Well, How do I get from text on a page? That's quite a lengthy process. How do you get from text on a page in ancient documents to believe that Caesar invaded Britain? Well, now that's no claim to the supernatural, but it requires a lot of historical research. And the way you do that, I like this question, and I've got a very detailed answer to it at the back end of my book, Gunning for God, because the arch skeptic about resurrections was the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. He was wrong, of course, as is not very difficult to see. But that means that many of my friends and colleagues just say this is absurd, and they say what you've just asked, how do you get from a text on a page? Well, the point is, texts in ancient documents are evidence, and ancient historians take them seriously. And that's where we start at the historical level. And many people, I find, have no idea what the textual evidence is behind the documents that now form the New Testament. And it's very important, actually, to get to grips with this. Otherwise, we get very superficial dismissals of this. Luke, who wrote the third gospel, was a brilliant ancient historian. And you get at ancient events by reading ancient history and what ancient historians say. Now, when it comes to this particular question, the interesting thing is not only do the vast majority, and I mean the vast majority of ancient historians, whether they're atheist, Christian, or anything else, not only agree that Jesus existed, but that many of the things claimed in the New Testament about him have a factual basis, including the fact that the disciples seem to have seen something. Now, that's as far as ancient history can go. But you see, there are two ways of approaching this. There's the objective historical methodology, and you can argue, and it's important to do so, and I've spent my life doing it, saying, well, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, how do you explain the empty tomb and things like that? Now, we can't go into that in detail now. But then there's another way, and that is the subjective thing, because if Jesus actually rose from the dead and is the Son of God, then he can be encountered now in our personal experience, and we can have our lives transformed. And I've seen this happen in my own life, the life of my family, but in the life of so many others who have come to faith in Christ from many different worldviews and found that he has fulfilled the promise that is on those pages of an ancient document. And in the end, I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Now, as to why some Christians don't engage.
So just to summarize that, because I think it's pretty important. Tell me if I got this right.
Important.
What?
It's very important.
Yeah, I know. That's what I want to summarize it. There's been also some really good chat about it too. But I think what you're saying is that actually there is actually a lot of evidence there, and you're not saying it in a superficial level. You really need to actually go look at that, engage it as a historian. And for me, I don't know if you read N.T. Wright's stuff, but N.T. Wright's stuff is really helpful in kind of clarifying that. So, you know, I'm an amateur. I mean, maybe I'm not going to speak for you. I'm an amateur when it comes to historian stuff, right? I mean, I don't speak any of the original languages. I've never actually seen the original documents. And the same way a lot of people have to rely on me for dealing with science, I really appreciated the both N.T. Wright's work and also the conversation he's had with skeptics of his work as well as really being helpful to kind of clarify what the evidence shows. So that's one thing. But then you're also talking about how the claim is that Jesus is alive and that the people still have a relationship with him, and you can have that sort of experience. And so that fits into it too. Is that a good way to really briefly summarize what you're saying?
Yes, it is, because you see, God for me is not a theory. There are theories about God, and they're important. He's a person who can be engaged with. And it's a cumulative kind of argument. The historical arguments about the resurrection, the logical arguments about the resurrection, and so on are all immensely important. But encountering the risen Jesus is the most important of all. But the subjective experience is validated by the historical facts. You asked me, why is it some Christians don't engage? I think one of the big problems for many of us is fear, that this is such an outlandish idea, and people say, you don't really believe that stuff. Not in the 21st century, do you? And unless you've got real confidence in the facts and in your own experience, a lot of peer pressure will soon silence you. And I think the reason that some people sadly don't go there is because they have been silenced in a politically correct society where you don't do God in public, as a famous British politician once said.
Well, I'll tell you, like one of the attractions for me when I was younger of intelligent design was that it seemed like it was a way to kind of press religiously important ideas without actually having to be explicitly religious. I've been engaging a lot with Michael Behe a lot. I don't think he's ever publicly talked about the resurrection. I think he personally affirms it. I mean, he's a Catholic, and so I'm not trying to say he's not a Christian. Is that like a good? I mean, is that just what some people are supposed to do, or is that something that really isn't really? How would you understand that?
Well, I know Michael, and I have a great respect for him, and I wouldn't judge it that way. I think people should be free to talk about what they believe in. Now, I believe that God is the designer of the universe. I do not think that that is an idea that came up 20 or 30 years ago and was called intelligent design. I think there's such confusion of thought about those words. Unless you clarify everything, it becomes difficult, although I've learned a great deal. I certainly believe that the universe has been designed by an intelligent God. And
I affirm design in that sense too. And unless you want to, we don't have to talk about intelligent design as a whole, but I was just
we can't. In terms of time, we can't, Joshua. But the one point I would make is this, that it's perfectly legitimate in my mind to ask yourself, is there scientific evidence? Say we're studying a black box. Sure. Is there scientific evidence that there's been an informational input into this system? And if that's what you mean by intelligent design, it's totally innocuous. But you see, the difficulty is those words, as you know, probably better than me, have become so loaded that once you go down that route, you lose the plot. So I would much prefer to be absolutely upfront and say, the one behind the universe is a personal God. But at this point, I'm interested in seeing if there are any evidences from our scientific activity and from the philosophy and history of science that might point in that direction. And that, of course, is a very lengthy discussion. But I don't want to stop there. You see, it seems to me that the Apostle Paul has said very clearly at the beginning of Romans that the universe does bear evidence of its origin in God. That is plain. And that legitimizes, I think, using...
That's not actually what Romans 1:20 says, right? It doesn't talk about the origins. It talks about God's eternal attributes.
Yes, that's right. Is evidence in the universe. Why? What did I say? That's what I meant to say.
No, that he's the origin of it. So it doesn't actually have a notion of creation. It has more of an issue of God's attributes.
I think that is perhaps picking at it, since Paul believed in the creation anyway. But
I agree with you that God created all things. I agree with you that it's plain to see.
Well, that's all I'm trying to say at this point. And then what Paul does, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to explain the gospel. And I think that this is what I, as a follower of Jesus, am commanded to do: go into all the world and preach the good news. And I want to do that. In other words, if you ask me what I'm trying to do, in my public discussions. It's, first of all, I'd like to build a bridge from whatever discipline is being considered, whether it's science, philosophy, or anything else, to talk about God. And then I'd like to build a further bridge to get beyond deism and things like that, to talk about the God I believe in, who has revealed himself in Christ. And then thirdly, I want to build a bridge from that to encouraging people to open up their minds to the possibility of a relationship with God, and the resurrection and all of that belongs there. But I want to try at least to get those three things across. It's not always possible every time, but for me, the resurrection is absolutely central.
Yeah, like I said, I think that's one of the things that I've really liked about you and your work. And I'm not asking you to be critical of others, but that's just the contrast that I've seen between you and not every Christian in the public square, but between a lot of them, honestly. So,
well, in a way, I'm a bit sad about that. Perhaps you ought to encourage them a bit more.
Well, I have. That's what I was asking. Do you really think that? Without singling out Michael Behe, to be clear, I mean, I was just giving him as an example as a person who I know probably personally affirms the resurrection without doubt, and has had a very public life. He's actually paid a lot of cost for his arguments career-wise, but he hasn't. The resurrection has been part of that. But there's a lot of other Christians that wouldn't take any risks in their career about anything, and there's also a lot that have been similar. I don't know. I mean, it just seems like it's kind of missing out on what the core part of it is. It just seems like it's missing something really important. I'll tell you also, that's one reason why I like Jim Tor. Jim Tor and I have our big disagreements. We've had some debates, even both privately and then a couple times online too. We have disagreements about things, but the place where we have just so much common ground is just that we found a lot of beauty in science, but we also are convinced that nothing in science threatens Jesus. He's greater than anything that we found in science, and that's what we want to spend time talking about.
Jim Tor is, to my mind, an outstanding example of someone who is a top-level scientist, but who is very courageous about articulating his faith in Jesus Christ. It's absolutely remarkable. And I find him an enormous inspiration to me. I've known him for some years, and he's been very courageous in the public domain and saying what he does.
I agree. So how do you think we encourage people to focus on that rather than a lot of the other stuff?
Well, I think, Joshua, it's important to model it. And why I say that is many younger people have come to me, and forgive the personal reference, but I get many emails thanking me for doing this and encourage them to stand up in public. Of course, most of them are not standing up in public, but in a big way, but they're doing it in their own little way. And one of the most encouraging letters I ever got was from a 12-year-old who came to a talk I did, and he wrote afterwards, a week later, he said, "I used your arguments in class and I won." And it was marvelous to hear a young chap who was given confidence. And I do emphasize that word, confidence. I meet many believers who have lost their confidence. They've lost their confidence in Scripture in particular. And they are frankly running scared of their peers, that they're afraid they might not get promotion. They are afraid that they might not be treated in the same way. And we've got to make up our minds. I did so a very long time ago in a very significant incident that occurred to me when I was 19, where a Nobel Prize winner tried to make me publicly renounce my faith in his presence in Cambridge.
So a teacher said that?
A Nobel Prize winner said that. I was sitting beside him at dinner, and I never met a person like that before at that level. And I said to him, in all your researches in science, did you ever gain the impression from any of them that there was a God behind the universe? And he was quite angry. And so I left it. Even at that age, I knew enough to back off. But at the end of the meal, he invited me to his room with a number of senior people. I've told this story in a recent book I've written called Can Science Explain Everything? And he sat me down, as far as I remember, and he said, now, Lennox, do you want a career in science? I said, yes, sir. Right, he said, in front of witnesses right now, give up this naive faith in God, because I tell you, it will cripple you intellectually. You will never make it. How about that for pressure? It was unbelievable. And I remember thinking later, if he had been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd probably been lost his job the next day. But I got, I believe, from God the courage to say to him, sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got in Christ? And he came out with the philosophy of Émile Bergson, and I happened to know about it. And I said, is that really all you've got to offer me? Because if it is, I'll take the risk. I'll stay with Christ. And I got up and walked out. Now, that was a seminal incident, as you can imagine, in my life. And I remember resolving, if I ever got into an academic position of the kind I've got now, I would never browbeat people like that.
And to be clear, we should be very clear, and I think this is important. That was a horrible incident. I don't think that most atheists would even be okay with that in an academic.
It was disgraceful. Most atheists that I know would be disgusted with it.
Yeah, so to be clear, it's not that all scientists are doing that. That happened. He did it in front of other people. I really wish some of them had stood up for you in that.
No, well, that was that. But it put steel into my heart. And when you face that at the age of 19, everything else seems a little bit more minor in comparison. But it really helped me to see that there's a dark side to academia, that there are people who will use their intellectual authority, not argument, he didn't have any argument, to try to suppress younger folks intellectually and to pull them away from their faith. And I simply said, well, Lord, if you help me, I will try and do the opposite. I will present the evidence in public and encourage people to go away, think about it, think about what the opposite is, what other people say, and make up their own minds.
Well, I think actually the way I would frame it in agreement with you is that it's an issue of abuse of power. And if we really take Christianity seriously, we really believe Jesus is who he said he was, he didn't come with coercion.
Absolutely not.
He had a different sort of relationship with power than we are inclined to take. And I don't think, it's very hard to imagine Jesus abusing power the way how we're...
It's completely impossible to imagine it.
And so, you know, I'll say that's actually one thing that's helped even as being a motivation to be a bit more public, because it's hard to talk about my faith directly with the students who are directly underneath me, because there's a power dynamic there and I don't want to be coercive.
Oh, I understand that, yes.
It's actually a lot easier to go talk in some ways, in important ways, because it puts me at risk instead of a student. So anyways, that's a side too, but I got to tell you, I really enjoyed talking to you, John. We're kind of coming up on almost an hour here.
Yeah.
I hope we can continue this conversation some more at some
point. Give us a few months and so on. I'd be very happy to, Joshua, because I think it's useful to do this kind of thing that we've done in public and to explore these sort of left field notions that don't always come up in conversation, because the conversations can so readily become technical. What do you believe about this? Does it show God exists or not? But we've been talking much more in detail about the whole dynamics of the communication of the Christian faith and its nature. And I think that's very profitable. I've enjoyed it immensely. And as I said, it's very nice to meet you at last.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is that element of it too. And I think the personal side is important. one thing I tell my atheist colleagues is that the reason why I'm a Christian and why they're atheists isn't because, you know, we process evidence differently, or, you know, I'm irrational or they're irrational or whatever. It's really just because I've seen some things that they haven't yet. And seeing those things really changed it. And I think that's actually been a helpful way for them to understand it as well. So, you know, even as we're talking about evidence, for example, in ancient texts and things like that, or the evidence of actually experiencing Jesus or seeing it in other people, there's a very different thing about just talking about it versus actually seeing it for yourself. And I think at some point, ultimately, we can't force a person to do that. I mean, we can talk about how we've seen it, and we're just inviting them to come see it too. And I think that's a far better apologetic, if we're going to go back to that word.
Well, the Lord himself, Jesus himself, it always has impressed me that he came to a certain region, as the Gospels report, and he did some very spectacular things, healing people and so on. And the people said, "Would you please leave?" And he did. He won't force himself into anybody's life. And that has always impressed me deeply, that God himself, become incarnate, gives us space. I mean, the thing is absolutely amazing. He doesn't force. And this could lead to a long discussion, but it's very important, it seems to me, to look carefully at the trial of Jesus, because he was accused of essentially of being a terrorist, using force against Rome. And Pilate was desperately concerned, the Roman governor. "Are you a king then?" "Well, yes, in a sense, but not in the sense you mean it," said Jesus. "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting." Now, that is hugely important to someone who's been brought up in Northern Ireland. It shows that folks that take weapons to defend Christ and his message are not Christian. They're not followers of Jesus at all, because he said no.
It's funny you focus on the trial, but it makes me think.
I'm not quite finished. Just
about the garden, right?
Yeah, no, just yes, that's the background to it. But I just wanted to keep it very short because we're near the end. That Jesus did explain, he said, "To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth." And Pilate said, "What is truth?" and went out and declared him innocent. And it seems to me that what John is telling us there is this: the one thing that you cannot get people to believe by force is truth, especially if it's truth about peace with God, salvation, forgiveness, eternal life. And therefore, we're not in the business of coercion at all.
I think that's actually, well, when I say it's by God raising Jesus from the dead that I know that he exists, sure, but it's also that he's good. It's because of these sorts of things. He had a different sort of
Yes, you
relationship.
have to take the whole thing. It's not one thing. It's the cumulative evidence that stands the test.
Well, I gotta say, I think we could talk for a lot longer, but I want to respect your time and also, you know, leave us waiting for something more. I'm looking forward to continue the conversation as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. I look forward to another occasion.
Well, I guess there's one question I have left. You say against the tide. What's the tide you're against?
Oh, in that context, it's the tide of naturalistic skepticism that dominates the academy. That's really what it is.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like you're very threatened by it. I mean, you're kind of confident.
No, but because I think that, well, I'm not threatened because I believe Christianity is true and naturalism is false. That's the blunt answer. But I believe that there's evidence that Christianity is true, and there's evidence that naturalism is false. But that's a discussion for another time, Joshua.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Hey, I gotta tell you, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's been really a pleasure. And
okay, lovely to meet you.
Conversation. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening in. And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to click subscribe, invite other people to listen in, and consider supporting us on Patreon too. So thanks a lot, guys.
Bye-bye.